what your aim was with your new book, your premise here.
Okay, so what happened was after the, I wrote most of What's the Matter with Kansas when I lived in Chicago, and also wrote it at my dad's house in Kansas City. And then I moved to, right before I finished it, I moved to Washington. And that was in 2003. And I really hadn't spent much time in Washington since the 1980s, back when I was a college student. And the first thing that astonished me about the city was how rich it was. Mm-hmm. And the second thing was how many scandals there were. In 04 it really started, after the Abramoff affair, that broke in early 04, but nobody really paid any attention to it till 05. And after that it was like a dam bursting. It's just one thing after another, after another, after another. I mean, just, what was it, last week, 2 weeks ago, that Senator Ted Stevens got indicted. Mm-hmm. A few days before that, you had the business with the politicization of the Department of Justice. A little while before that, you have the business with the Federal Aviation Administration. And there's stuff, just one thing after another, after another. And I'm reading this in the newspaper, and saying, what is going on here? What explains this tidal wave of corruption? But it's not just corruption. There's also the other two things that you notice here are this sort of fantastic misgovernment. Epic incompetence all across the federal government in certain remarkable ways. I referred earlier to the Federal Aviation Administration, but all these agencies essentially being run, regulatory agencies being run in the interests of the regulated industry, which is a bizarre thing when you think about it. And then the third thing is the massive outsourcing, the contracting out and privatizing of federal operations, which is really the signature gesture of the Bush administration. And what I came to understand after studying these three phenomena is that they are all in some way together, that they're linked, that they're all three expressions of the same way of looking at the world.
And that is?
Mm-hmm. Well, the short answer is just to say conservatism. But that's not fair for a number of reasons. The slightly longer and more correct answer is the way of looking at the world that gives rise to all these things is the way that understands the free market as being like the ideal nexus of human society, and that understands government as an imposition and as a corrupt entity by its very nature. And we see that the people who call themselves conservatives are the main bearers of this ideology.
And you also argue in the book that conservatives want government to be incompetent and intentionally try to make it so that the free market would be then invited in to take these contracts, to take over government functioning, because they, in their belief, think that the free market system is superior, as you say, to what they believe is a corrupt government.
When you put it that way, it sounds so improbable and unlikely, and yet I came across in my research an essay from 1928, I think it was, back in the Coolidge administration or something, and it was written by a former president of the Chamber of Commerce, of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is still to this day, one of the biggest players here in D.C. In terms of the lobbying and that sort of thing. And the president of the Chamber of Commerce back then, in 1928, wrote this essay, or was interviewed. They interviewed him and called it an essay, and he had this immortal line where he said that, the best public servant is the worst one. And then he went on to explain what he meant by this idea. The best public servant is the worst one. You don't want good, talented people in public service, because then they'll do things right, and they'll persuade the public that the government works, and then the people will trust the government, and the next thing it's a slippery slope to communism, and it's also, if you have good public servants, they'll meddle in the affairs of private enterprise and all this sort of thing. So the interests of business are to keep good, the best and the brightest out of government. And I was pretty shocked when I came across this. And what's even more shocking is that you find that same idea, not in exactly the same terms, but the same idea reiterated down through the history of American conservative thinking. You know, lots of people argue this. This isn't just one zany dude in 1928. This is like this is a widely held view. And
it's a theme you can follow all the way through to
right.
the Republican Revolution of '94, because former Speaker Gingrich would speak of the incompetence of government and the bureaucrats in particular.
Oh yeah, that's the other side of the coin, is this constant denunciation of bureaucrats. President Reagan was sort of a champion at that. And then you remember, I don't know if you remember some of these guys, like you remember Donald Devine, who he appointed to be the head of the Office of Personnel Management. I mean, they had a very antagonistic attitude towards federal workforce. And I mean, I'm sort of getting away from the subject here, but that sends out that, this constant abuse heaped on federal workers by their bosses, Gingrich, Reagan, whoever. What kind of message does that send to the sort of people that used to come and work for the government? Well, if you're hated and despised and your boss wishes you would go away, you're not going to go work for the federal government. You're going to go do something else with your life. And back in the 80s, this was all kind of shocking, you remember? And a lot of people wrote about it. I mean, it's all happening again now under the Bush administration, but it's not as shocking because we've been through it once already, and so you see a lot less written about it. But back in the 80s, when this was all new and fresh, and they would do studies of how federal employees felt about it, about being abused in this way, and they felt really bad about it. I remember one study, a guy. He was trying to stick up for federal workers in the mid-'80s, and he said, "Look, it's customary to, denounce bureaucrats and talk about how awful they are, but the fact is, these people. Here's one way of measuring their level of accomplishment. They've won, I think it's 6 Nobel Prizes in Nobel Prizes for health, since in the last 20 years or whatever it was at the time. That was like 86. So I think he was counting from 1968 or something like that. And I went back and looked up those Nobel Prizes. And they were, yes indeed, won by all sorts of employees of the federal government. People that you would never think of, like someone at a VA hospital or someone at the National Institutes of Health or something like that. And they had won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Well, if you go from when he wrote that essay up until now, and say how many U.S. federal government employees have won the Nobel Prize in medicine, it's a single guy.
Now, you break the book up into 2 parts. You have the insurgents, and then you have saboteurs. Tell us about the 2 parts and why you broke it up in that way.
All right. I'm going to drink some water first, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Water is okay.
The first part of the book, Insurgents, is about the conservative movement outside government, but still here in Washington. The book is about conservatism in Washington as opposed to, say, conservatism in a place like Kansas, which is a completely different animal. What I discovered when I studied the conservative movement in Washington is that you can describe it as a movement, but you can also describe it quite accurately as an industry. And it has all these different ways of making a profit. In some ways it's politics for profit. But it sort of started with direct mail back in the 1970s. So this discovery by certain people on the right, most of them living in the suburbs of Northern Virginia, which is, by the way, where most of the industry conservatism is still headquartered there. But they discovered that they could make a lot of money with these kind of frightening letters advancing whatever cause of the extreme right, sent out by the million to average Americans all over the country. And you remember things like the Panama Canal giveaway. This was a great little money-raising idea. Never really did anything to stop the legislation, but but there's numerous things like that, all sorts of issues that you could raise money with, and then you find the movement advancing on to doing other things, like, for example, essentially selling its services to industry to go after the left, because the left, costs business money. If they get their laws enacted, or if they get a union organized, or whatever it happens to be, it's expensive for industry. So selling themselves to industry as soldiers, to engage in the political war. And then you find the sort of, what I thought was the most amazing efflorescence of industry conservatism, which came up in the Iran-Contra affair. You remember when Oliver North and a bunch of other people, but Oliver North is the one that we most remember for it, were trying to sort of build this mechanism for for running foreign policy that was completely outside of government. They would raise money privately for the Contras, or they would do it by selling government property. Remember, they sold weapons to Iran.